Greetings to all listeners and viewers out there. My name is Tamara Mathebula. I am the Chairperson of the Commission for Gender Equality. Today, we will be talking about one of the most exciting topics and yet depressing status of women, especially African women, in the context of culture, in the context of tradition, as well as in the context of customs. We will unpack how African women not only define their heritage, but how African women define their culture and define their identity, but how they have been denied equal environment and equal enjoyment of their fundamental human rights. We are all aware that human rights are still women's rights, right? This is a very relevant topic as we reflect and as we celebrate our own heritage during the National Heritage Month of September. During this important time of the year, there are few points that one can actually touch on where we actually celebrate our rich and our diverse heritage. And we also celebrate our diverse cultures, and we celebrate, so many things. And we've been doing this for many years. We have done this in a variety of ways of celebrating our heritage. We have done this through celebrating our culinary traditions, our rituals, our songs, and our dances. We do this in different ways because the beginning to actually define who we are, and this begins to even define where we come from as Africans, in particular as African queens and African princesses of this beautiful continent. Not forgetting the gender non-conforming people. We pride ourselves with beautiful, colorful, traditional outfits, and we prepare and we share special meals as we strive to create a sense of cohesion of our different countries where we come from in this particular continent. In many African nations, I want to say that it's a fact that this matter that we are talking about here today of cultural heritage is undeniable, and that we have expressed and interacted with our heritage and our culture as part of our identity in different ways. And this is also equally undeniable. Now, coming to terms with our different heritages and different aspects of cultural identity, I can actually say this for me feels liberating. And I must also say that, however, it can also be a site of struggle for many African women at the same time. We need to look at the impact of culture, the impact of tradition, the impact of customs in relation to gender equality. In many African nations, women have historically faced unequal social, economic, legal, political, as well as cultural treatment because of their gender. And we need to begin to explore legislative as well as policy imperatives and recommendations to assist this particular continent of ours to move progressively towards creating a gender balance in their governance, in their policy, public policies, and in their systems as well as practices. We need to ask ourselves difficult questions, whether the envisaged change towards making sure that we achieve gender equality will ever occur peacefully over the next decade, or over the next 2 or 3 decades, or over the next century, as we want to really strike and achieve a balanced gender continent, Africa. We know for a fact that change is likely to happen as the continental women are actually slowly and progressively moving towards, talking about the need for gender equality, but also these women are moving more towards exposure to information and telecommunications technologies, and there are growing regional as well as international women's movements that are beginning to actually increase the awareness and increase the gender comparison with our cultures, with our traditions, as well as with our customs. I must say that if we look back a little bit and look at what we have in many countries, in many African nations, women have historically, really looked at how we can improve ourselves in the continent. And we have actually looked at what kind of policies and legislations we need. And I would start our conversation by basically looking at what we have regionally, internationally, and then we focus on what we have locally in our own countries. First and foremost, I must say that many countries in our beautiful continent are members of the international community. And these members, like South Africa, we have, since the advent of democracy, have ratified and signed and acceded to many treaties, including the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, which is known as the CEDAW, which was ratified by South Africa in 1996 without a single reservation. Again, if we cast our eyes further and look at what this article of CEDAW is saying, and we focus on Article 2, it actually defines discrimination, and it includes violence against women as a form of discrimination. Whilst Article 16 of the CEDAW requires state parties to take all appropriate measures to eliminate all forms of discrimination against women and against members of LGBTIQ communities. And it further obliges state parties to ensure that the betrothal and the marriage of a child shall have no legal effect, and all necessary actions, including legislations, shall be taken to specify a minimum age of marriage and to make the registration of marriages compulsory. Let me move away from the CEDAW articles and really look at another one that we have in the region. In the region, we do have the protocol on the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, on the rights of women. And this protocol is known as the Protocol to the African Charter. But if you focus on Article 13 of this particular protocol, subsection 1b, it actually provides that all states parties must enact and effectively implement appropriate legislative and regulatory measures, including those prohibiting and curbing all forms of discrimination, as well as particularly those that are harmful practices to other people. And these tend to have danger or endanger the health and general well-being of women and young girls. And it also contains important provisions on reproductive rights, on marriage rights, on divorce rights, as well as inheritance rights, among others. Let me quickly again move away from what we have in the region and really look at what we have in our different countries in the region. And I will talk particularly about what we have in South Africa. So in addition to these regional as well as international commitments, many African countries and South Africa have included or have what we call constitutions. And in South Africa, we do have a constitution which enshrines the rights of all people in South Africa and other African countries. And this affirms the kind of democratic values of human dignity, of equality and freedoms. And in particular, if you look at Section 7 of the South African Constitution, it actually declares its supremacy, but also Section 1C and Section 2 of the Constitution provides for the fact that there are laws, and any law or conduct inconsistent with this particular supreme law, which is the Constitution, is invalid. The right to equality, including gender equality is one of the fundamental pillars of the Constitution, and it is enshrined in the Bill of Rights, which is justiciable in the South African context. On the other hand, the Constitution actually provides for and protects the rights to culture. Section 15, subsection 3, and 30 and 31 of the Constitution recognizes traditional leadership. Section 211 and Section 212 of the Constitution actually recognizes the interpretation of protection of polygamy, for an example, as well as related practices such as spouse inheritance, widow rituals, ukungenwa kwabafazi, which is levirate, as well as sororate unions, forced marriages and ukuthwalwa, female genital mutilations, breast sweeping or ironing of the breast, the primogenital rule, practices such as cleansing after male circumcision, and witch hunting. And this witch hunting, which usually happens to elderly women who are old and looking a bit funny and ugly with no teeth. So they are called witches. And this is one of the rule that the Constitution is beginning to look at. All these are customary practices that are harmful to specific groups, such as women, such as young girls, but also have an impact or have a tendency of undermining the constitutional guarantees of gender equality. However, the provisions protecting the rights to culture explicitly include a qualification stipulating that no one is exercising or should exercise the rights, and if someone does this, this person is inconsistent with the provisions of the Bill of Rights, especially Section 30 and Section 31, subsection 2 of the Constitution. And if I can just quickly again, just swiftly look at what we have in South Africa in terms of protections and legislative frameworks. For an example, in the case of children, we do have the Children's Act, number 38 of 2005. And subsection 12 of this act basically talks about social, cultural, and religious practices that are prohibited to practices that are doing female genital mutilation to children, to female children, and contravention of these is basically prohibited, and it cannot be allowed. And any person that is found to be doing this can be sentenced or can be fined or can be sentenced to imprisonment up to 10 years if found guilty. Let me quickly come back to what we have as a Commission for Gender Equality. For an example, we do have an act that is beginning to look at prohibition of unfair discrimination. And this act is called Promotion of Equality and Prevention of Unfair Discrimination Act, number 2000, and which is shortly known as the PEPUDA. And this act begins to define certain areas of discrimination that is happening to many people in South Africa, such as hate speech, harassments, prohibited on the grounds of gender, and as well as prohibitions on the grounds of unfair discrimination on the basis of gender-based violence and female genital mutilation that is currently happening in our region. So all of this is actually information that we should actually be having. But if I also just want to take a very quick sweep on what we also currently having in the South African context, for an example, we do have acts such as the Criminal Law, Sexual Offences, as well as Related Matters Amendment Act, number 32 of 2000. And this act basically looks at issues of sexual harassment. It looks at issues of age of consent for sexual intercourse between a child and an adult. And these acts currently, as we speak, have actually gone through the normal processes of review, and they are in front of Parliament for review and for making sure that they come back speaking to issues that we are currently facing, both as women, as young girls, as well as children in South Africa. We also have broader acts that are looking at issues of recognition of customary marriages, Act number 120 of 1998. And these are the issues that we are beginning to talk about when you talk about recognition of customary marriage. What are the rights of the bride? What are the rights of the bridegroom? And must we consent as both parties? And what is the age of consent in terms of marriage when you are a young bride? Is 18 years enough? Or if you are married under that, what steps can we do in terms of prevention of early child or under marriage or underage kinds of marriages that we see in different regions? Secondly, we have an issue and an act or a bill that is basically looking at a big issue that we have in Africa, which is the prevention and combating of trafficking of persons. Especially in Africa, we see quite a lot of trafficking of young girls. In different provinces, it's happening. In different countries, it's happening. And this bill basically begins to prohibit the recruitment and sale, as well as supply and procurement and transportation of women, of young girls, in the name of actually getting them some kind of work in different countries and in different provinces. And this bill is beginning to prohibit this. And we are saying that parents, relatives, and other people that are responsible for children should actually make sure that they are on guard all the time in terms of making sure that they don't sell their own children. And if found guilty, they are prosecuted under Section 4 of this bill for actually selling their children and in exchange of money. Same happens with ukutwala or customary practices. Our parents in different villages are actually beginning to sell their own little girls to elderly men, to rich men in exchange of a dowry or money. And this is unacceptable as we see what is happening in our country. So I must say that in a nutshell, despite the harmful nature and the violation of many of the rights of women, these practices persist. They persist because they are not questioned and they are not challenged. And therefore, we take an aura of morality in the eyes of those that are practicing them. And we are saying we cannot continue like this as a country and as a continent. And I must say that there are certain practices that I'm not going to go to, like widowhood, like female genital mutilation. And these are some of the things that are happening in our country and in our beautiful region. And I'm saying that, in conclusion, what we need to do as the country, as the region, we need to make sure that our governments should enact and regularly review their legislations for effectively combating all forms of violence, including rape, violence against women and children. And in connection, I want to say that penalties should actually be there. Should people be found guilty, they should be penalized for doing something very much against the will of another person. And that's violation of the human rights, of a woman's rights. And I must say that the second area is that the hearing of cases of rape should actually be in camera, and details should actually be published, because the reason why we go on as usual, it's because the perpetrators are not known. So if we publicize and if we make sure that we put cameras during these hearings, people will actually be known that they are perpetrators. And we still have the issue of the register, that should you be found to be a perpetrator, you should be entered into the register. When it comes to traditional practices as well as dowries and the bride prices, this should actually be condemned, because what we see is that people will abuse their spouses in the name of the fact that I have paid a dowry or a lump sum for you, and these actually should be condemned and heavy penalty inflicted against those that are guilty, including parents that are actually beginning to negotiate extra monies for the dowry for the young girl. Families must actually make sure that they are sensitized in terms of what needs to happen, and they should in turn report these kinds of violences that are inflicted to their families and to their children. More and more women should be inducted in law enforcement, and they should know about the law enforcement machinery, and they must know a lot about police officers, judiciary, medical personnel, and counseling services that they should access. Gender sensitization should actually be extended to members of the judiciary as well as law enforcement, like police. They should know how to handle cases of gender-based violence, and they should be trained to actually handle these cases as institutions. There should be mechanisms for networking and exchanging information on violence, and we know that through our social media these days, the information can actually be, can actually go an extra mile in terms of sensitizing people, in terms of, campaigns, literacy, information that people should know with regards to, where to go and how you should actually conduct yourself should you be found in a situation of gender-based violence. And I must say that national government organizations also have a role to play in terms of bringing available information to communities where they are. In particular, information that is required both by males, by women, by females, but also by traditional leaders in those particular communities as the custodians of our traditions, our customs, and as people who are actually leading in terms of looking at our values and norms and standards in those particular communities. We also urge women's organizations to stand up and to make sure that there are efforts in terms of eradicating these kind of scourges of gender-based violence and gender inequality in our communities. And I'm saying that in my closure, I'm challenging the African queens, the African princesses. We need to go back to basics of our moral values and retain what was so sacrosanct in our heritage, in our culture, and in our identity. I thank you for listening. Thank you.